Okay, so our Toaster Challenge guest this morning is Penelope Shuttle. Penelope Shuttle has lived in Cornwall since 1970 and is the widow of the poet Peter Redgrove. She's an adventurous and wide-ranging poet, praised for her spare style, often with very little kind of punctuation. The poems are very close, I think, to song. They're open-ended, often incantatory, drawn to extended sequences, notably in Missing You, her lament for Peter Redgrove, and now in her new extended sequence, Lyonesse, which we'll talk about. But just to give a bit of history, first of all, her first collection of poems, The Orchard Upstairs, was followed by six other books from Oxford University Press: The Child Stealer, The Lion from Rio, Adventures with My Horse, Taxing the Rain, Building a City for Jamie, and Selected Poems 1980 to 1996. And then a leaf out of his book from Oxford Poets and Redgrove's Wife, and Sangria and Hourglass from Bloodaxe Books. That collection, Redgrove's Wife, was shortlisted for both the Forward Prize and the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2006. Sangria and Hourglass was a Poetry Book Society recommendation, and her retrospective, Unsent, New and Selected Poems, drew on 10 collections published over 3 decades, plus that title collection, Unsent. And the later collections from Bloodaxe are Will You Walk a Little... Sorry. Her later collections from Bloodaxe are Will You Walk a Little Faster, and now Lyonesse, which is out in June, just now. Um, so it's interesting as well that Penelope Shuttle was actually first published as a novelist, and she's published several works of fiction, including All the Usual Hours of Sleeping, Wailing Monkey Embracing a Tree, and Rain Splitter in the Zodiac Garden. And with Peter Redgrove, she was the co-author of The Wise Wound, Menstruation in Every Woman, and Alchemy for Women, Personal Transformation Through Dreams and the Female Cycle, as well as a collection of poems, The Hermaphrodite Album, and two novels, The Terrors of Dr. Trevilles, a romance, and The Glass Cottage, a nautical romance in 1976. Her work has been widely anthologized, can be heard on the Poetry Archive website. Her poetry has been broadcast frequently on BBC Radio 3 and 4. Her poem Outgrown was used recently in a radio and television commercial. So she's been a judge of many poetry competitions, is a Hawthornden Fellow and a tutor for the Poetry School, and is currently chair of the Falmouth Poetry Group, which is one of the longest running poetry workshops in the UK. And she joins me now from Falmouth in Cornwall. And that's a dauntingly impressive CV, Penelope.
Yes,
So I just say that
yes.
for, and you're very welcome to Books for Breakfast. Um, your the new book that we're here to talk about is called Lyonesse. I mean, it's a very evocative place name that might be familiar to people from Arthurian mythology, this the kind of legendary kingdom of a long kind of strand of land that stretches from Land's End to what is now, this was the Isles of Scilly, and in that Celtic Sea portion of the Atlantic Ocean. Or people might know it from Thomas Hardy, when I set out for Lyonesse and so on. But I just wonder, I mean, what exactly does Lyonesse mean to you? And can you tell us about this book and how you came to write it and what Lyonesse meant kind of in the beginning to you and as the sequence developed?
Uh, well, Peter, like quite a lot of my work, it happened accidentally, without planning. Um, I was actually attending a workshop. It was in January 2015, run by Katrina Naomi, and she gave a wonderful workshop. And she gave each of us a slip of paper with a hidden message for a prompt for writing on it. Now, I had just finished my previous collection, Will You Walk a Little Faster, which focuses quite a lot on walking around cities, specifically London and Bristol. So I had written a lot about cities. And so I opened this slip of paper and it says, write about a city. And of course, it was a completely random handout. Katrina wasn't persecuting me. It was simply that, and I looked at it and I thought, blimey, cities again. And I was really discombobulated. Everyone else starts writing away. And I just went out. There were beautiful gardens in where we were in an annex of the cafe. So I went out into the gardens, which we always said to participants, if you want to wander around the gardens and write notes. I went outside into the drizzle and I thought, what on earth have I got left to say about cities? Nothing. And I sat down, beautiful gardens looking over the Helford River, and this first line came out of nowhere. The gown shops of Lyonesse took satin for granted. Out of nowhere, except my slight rage at being given a city to write about. But it was one of those things, when you do get these messages for writing, and it came in with a message that says, "Listen to me." And so I sat there and I wrote the first draft of a poem called The Gown Shops. And uh, then I went home and I wrote quite a lot of poems around the theme of Lyonesse, which I would never have chosen because if you live in Cornwall, it comes fully packaged as a tourist attraction. So it's a big cliche. So this is something, if you live in Cornwall, you would basically avoid. But the first poem didn't allow me to avoid it. And then when something comes to you, you have to sort of dig right down into it. And as the poems came, the drafts, and I dug down into it, I realized that Lyonesse was a kind of lost paradise and that it was actually standing for earlier parts of my life, when Peter and I were going around traveling, writing, when we had a very innate companionship that I sort of then ended when Peter died. And I realized it was a way of thinking about loss, but also I became aware too that as the actual geographical event that submerged the far region of Cornwall was from a Bronze Age inundation event. It was a climate change event, probably a series of storms, but obviously that's in the face of possible extinction. That's another subject. And I had to kind of negotiate a personal relationship with that. So I wasn't jumping on a
Sure.
bandwagon, but obviously that came into it and wove its way through.
We'll come back to that because I'm very interested in that bit. But I love how you say that. I mean, the first line that came into your head out of nowhere, and it is. I mean, the gown shops of Lyonesse took satin for granted. I mean, it's a great line. It's full of mystery, and yet it's very kind of particular. I mean, gown shops and satin. I mean, and I'm interested in the idea this was what set the whole thing in motion. I mean, it's kind of often the way it happens. There's a trigger,
It is.
and then
It is.
something happens. I mean, and maybe you might actually read because I'd love people to hear
Sure.
that poem, and we can talk about how you kind of develop the sequence from that. Um,
Sure. The gown shops. The gown shops of Lyonesse took satin for granted. Silk was cheaper than salt, but velvet rip-roared like the water lions of the West who dealt the city its fate. Those frocks wore themselves to rags overnight, along streets pinned to the tides, gardens groomed by the waves. When the weather forgot its place in Lyonesse, every dress was a flounce in the wrong direction in all the bars and ballrooms as the city swam for its life. And in the last wet mirror Lyonesse held up to itself, not a gown to be seen, nor a child, if tempest truth be told, in the place where Lyonesse had been.
That's great. I mean, you can kind of see, I mean, and hear how that would be the start of a big adventure. I mean,
Mm.
that sense of a fully kind of realized other world. You know, the satin, the silk, the weather forgetting its place, the flouncing in the wrong direction. So we're in a world which is sort of familiar, but it's also deeply kind of strange. I mean, it's a world that has its own rules. It's a world that's both there and not there, and it seems to kind of almost disappear at the end. It kind of comes in and out of focus. It kind of um, and you have that kind of sense throughout. It's a very particular place, but it's a place with its own rules
Mm.
as well.
Yeah, that was kind of a given as the first poems came. But I think because there are dress shops and bars and ballrooms, it gives actuality to the place, and so that kind of gave me a marker to describe it as a real place. And in fact, as I got, as you get deeper and deeper into a theme, I began to look at other sunken cities, and I think it was on Channel 5, one of those documentaries that explain things very, very, very slowly several times over. And they focused on the sunken city of Baie, which was Nero's version of Las Vegas. It was
Mm.
a city on the coast down from Rome, which was it fell into the sea. And in this documentary, you saw the most beautiful statues being brought up and the temples and so on. And so that kind of again another marker of the actuality of these cities, the life that was there, people just like us.
So you have that kind of, I suppose I mean, you have the actual kind of historical kind of or geographical kind of inundation of of the part of the world where you live, kind of in the Bronze Age, but and then you have this kind of notion of Atlantis coming in there, and the notion of these sunken cities. I know you went to an exhibition
Ah,
in the
yes.
British Museum, and that played a role too, didn't it?
It did. That made a huge impact on me. These were cities on the Nile, Canopus and Thonis Heracleon, and they were built effectively on sand. And over the years, they just sank down. But they were also cities that, in the pre-Christian era, the records seem to show that they were very tolerant of all religions, that lots
Mm.
of different religions lived there, and they were huge trading cities for Egypt. But when they were Christianized, the Christianized population, probably with some encouragement from the church, threw many of their beautiful pagan anyway, statues into the sea before the cities actually fell. So they gave up part of their identity already when they were Christianized. So
Yeah.
that was quite an interesting nexus of of how a city kind of destroys itself before the weather destroys it and the ground falls beneath it.
But it's
And
part of
that
what you, yeah, I mean, it's part of what you call, I mean, I suppose the universality of loss. I mean, you know, the
it
kind of,
is, yeah.
the physical cities but also it's, you know, because it's our human experience, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
we're here and then we're erased from the record, isn't it? Isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
that's very much kind of part of what's happening in the poems, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, because you said that at one point, you said that Lyonesse offers me new ways to write about loss.
Mm. Well, I've written quite a number of poems and collections that are focused on bereavement. You mentioned the sequence Missing You, which
Yes,
came
sure.
out in Redgrove's Wife. Um, and you kind of have to shift your perspective. I feel that people who are kind enough to read me have heard enough about me very specifically talking about either
Hmm.
Peter, and shortly after, a few years after that, I lost a very, very close friend. We both had children in the same year in 1976 and gone through all of the child rearing, supporting one another, and that was a loss. Um, and once the Lyonesse came, out of left field, and I began to think, well, what is it that has drawn me so deeply? Sorry, my ears are grotesquely small. What has drawn me to it? And it was writing about loss, not
Sure.
my specific ones, but loss is what everyone experiences. And so to do loss through cities just became part of the atmosphere I was writing in.
And two, I mean, obviously the sea is everywhere. I mean the tang of it, the feel of it, the ships, the sailors, piratical sounding voices that kind of come in now and then. So it's the fruit of also it's a very coastal sort of imagination. I mean, the sea and its rhythms I know are very important to you, and I suppose that's one of the things that Falmouth must give you.
I think this is again another way of writing about something that you're not specifically putting yourself at the center of.
Hmm.
It's not like my poems about Cornwall, but it is very much my experience of living since I was 22 in this maritime climate and
Yes.
atmosphere. And also, I think there's something atavistic going on because my mother's family came from coastal Essex, and the guys were all seafaring guys. They either crewed for the Americas yachts, or they were in the merchant navy. And I sometimes think all of that nautical thing is must be buried somewhere down
Yeah.
in my genes, and I kind of reconnected with that.
Sure.
Um, yeah, so again, it's writing about kind of writing new ways without putting myself centrally at it. I put Lyonesse in the place where normally perhaps I would be.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, this might be actually a good place to read another poem from it. Make a Wish.
Make a wish. The sky has no favourites in Lyonesse, but favours all with its fair or foul. Lyonesse will always be just what you want it to be. Streets paved with the sea, days of dogfish and dolphin, the swordfish patrolling isle and pew, knights learning their place in rock pool after rock pool. Lyonesse offers you what can't be given or taken, bought or sold. Here you can have everything you wish for and wish it away as Lyonesse goes down in the sigh of the last ship.
Yeah, I love those. I'm intrigued by those lines. Lyonesse offers you what can't be given or taken, or you must forget everything. As well. That notion of, you must forget everything, sang Lyonesse, everything but down here. As well. I suppose that kind of touches on the real nature of Lyonesse, that it's a place for the imagination to run freely, that it's an alternative reality. It's its own place that you have to learn, or you have to leave this world behind a bit to engage with Lyonesse itself.
I think it is kind of in the threshold area between our daily world and our unconscious. The sea is a huge element in our individual unconscious processes, our dreams, and also in the collective unconscious. And if you go right back, it's kind of a cliche, but to say we all came from the sea long ago. But I think in these lines, I'm really, in a way, thinking about how we work with the imagination, because you cannot force the imagination. You have to be in the slipstream of it. You can't take from it, and it won't necessarily give to you. And it will just give you everything, and it will take it away. And then it's also, in a wider sense, it's also fate, which gives you something in your life and then takes it away. So it's quite a lot to do with kind of just processes of actually how we think about how we live, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, they're great images.
And about the spontaneity of writing, because sometimes people do say to me, "Where do you get your ideas from?" And what is your strategy? To which I have to say, I don't actually have one. I'm just kind of here, because with the antennae out, waiting.
Yeah, the antennae are important. I think because it's full of. I mean, it's full of all kinds of things. That really kind of struck me. I mean, the images that kept pulling me into sort of the immersiveness or the immersive reality of it. I mean, there was an image of fish swimming through the branches of the forest, for instance, in Our Cradle Sea, or there was the girls named after the boats instead of the other way around.
The girls named after the boats is from coastal Essex. My mother told me,
okay,
she was talking about her family, that the fishing boats would be named after people and girls in the family. And I had an aunt, my mother's elder sister, whose name was Wavelet, Lette, which is a coastal Essex name from the past, but it was to do with the boat.
The boat,
the daughter.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it was that kind of a good luck thing, or just they thought, well, we'll use the same name for both.
I love that, yeah.
So things sometimes in poems, Peter, that look as if they're an imagined thing, have very got their roots in a real happening.
It's also coming. I mean, Lyonesse is also it's a place for lovers as well. I mean, very much like its patron saint is Valentine, and it's close to my own heart as well, because Valentine's heart is housed just down the road from us here in Dublin in Whitefriars Street Church.
Oh.
Now, I mean, he might have had a big heart because I think there are bits of it around in churches around the world, but supposedly
his skull is in Rome.
But his heart, but we have his heart apparently. But
didn't he travel though? What a traveller! No wonder he went to Lyonesse.
Maybe. what I mean, Lyonesse can't get used to the dark. You think there'd be a switch, a candle, a match. These are kind of some random lines that really I really kind of felt drawn to. That was from In the Dark, or Lyonesse is a blind alley where I forget what hangs my bones together. That was in May the Holy Ghost blow your sailboat home. And sort of, I don't know, forgetting and memory are both important, aren't they?
They are. I think that's definitely looking back in the time after bereavement, when
Yeah.
everything's dark. Um, yes, yes, so there are memories there of the bereavement. But as I said, I didn't want to put it centrally with me. I wanted to set it in Lyonesse as I'd been given Lyonesse is a way forward.
There are some lines too. I mean, I love the lines about the devil being an Englishman, and
And
you have
yeah, that comes from a Cornish tale. Yes, well, they would, you see.
they,
It would be an Englishman.
he would be, wouldn't he?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think you're going to read that for us, actually, isn't it?
I will, I will. The devil. In Lyonesse, the devil is still an Englishman, speaking English to all his Luciferian angels, and not some skanky language fit only for lions, as the bards frown in Cornish, and the sailors off Land's End draw up nets crammed with old doors, casements and porches, from the place they call the town. I've seen for myself a Lyonesse made of ice and air and sunshine, conjured on a blue winter sea in Falmouth Bay, polychrome towers, medallioned piers, portals, spires and porticos, columns mimicking trees and branches, hierophantic clusters of maypole belfries, courtier-like and gaudy for God. All the ruthless architectural audacity and curvaceous elaboration of the Sagrada Familia, but it was the devil's weatherwork, conjuring up a ghost city from the last glacial maximum, lost lunar, gone again in an hour.
That's great. I mean, I'm wondering too, Penelope, like with a subject like this, I mean, do you have a strong sense of, a Cornish identity that's distinct from an English one, and how would you sort of define that? I mean, I'm thinking because there's often a sense of conflict between, you read about conflicts between permanent residents and incomers or blow-ins, as they get called in Ireland. So I'm just wondering about that. I mean, that's been in the news again, sort of
It,
recently. But is there a sense of that kind of distinction between, I suppose, people in Cornwall, and is England somehow an other, or
it's hugely complicated issue. When my daughter was at school in the 80s, and this was at junior school, she once casually remarked that all the Cornish kids played together and all the kids who'd come down, families had moved for work and whatever, played a bit separately, though there were moments where they crossed over. She was very friendly with two little Cornish girls who are also Jehovah's Witnesses. So I think that just shows how complex the Jehovah's Witness family were very Cornish, and yet
yeah,
there were separations and little kids sorting out who they are. Am I Cornish? Am I English? But it seemed to be it was out aggro. It was just the children knew there was some cultural differences.
mm,
So that's going back there. But I mean, now, I mean, we've got the G7 coming in here for the weekend in St Ives. The weekend is 11th to the 13th.
right,
In Falmouth, we're now currently basically a police state. So we've had our car parks closed. There are some roads where cars may not stop at all. We've got in St Ives, they've covered over all the drains so that people can't put poison down them. We have
mm,
dedicated protest areas. Now, obviously, I wasn't born in Cornwall, but I've been here so long, I'm very adopted to it. And I can't tell you that people in Cornwall are not happy about the G7. And it's a perfect example of the exploitation that
mm,
happens to Cornwall. And of course, the other exploitation, don't get me started, sec second homes.
Yes.
We have a huge amount of second homes. We have students, noisy students in private housing. And the farmers I moved to, which was quite small and actually quite run down, I mean, it's that everything's so paradoxical. The university brings a lot of prosperity, it brings jobs. It means all these kids are in the coffee shops when they're open. Um, so it's a huge ongoing difficult situation psychologically, and the social deprivation that goes on in Cornwall, particularly around post mining areas, people know nothing about, and
Yeah.
then vegan extent.
Sure. But let me go back, Penelope, let me go back to the book because it's unusual in lots of ways. I mean, first of all, what's interesting to me is it's effectively two books in one. I mean, there's Lyonesse and
Yeah,
there's the second part, New Lamps for Old. And I mean, it comes in at 150 pages. I mean, I have to say it's refreshing to see a publisher undertake a large volume like this.
yeah,
And I kind of, I also liked it. I find it interesting to see people writing in the longer forms. I mean, you mentioned Missing You, which was an extended lament for Peter Redgrove, and the effect of that is greatly enhanced. I think when you get the interdependency of the poems, you get the flow and the pacing, and you know. Likewise in Lyonesse, I mean, I think the success comes from that sort of sense of an extended flow and poems kind of talking to each other and bouncing off each other and all of that. But I'm wondering, I mean, did the second section, which is called New Lamps for Old, did that come after Lyonesse? Were you kind of specifically writing it kind of against that, or were you saying, okay, I've done this, now I'm going to do a very different kind of thing, or again,
they kind
um,
of interwove after about because I wrote the Lyonesse from 2015, and it went to the publisher in February 2019.
mm,
Um, and about halfway through, so let's say about 2017, I was completely inundated with the Lyonesse poems
mhm,
to the point that this is now overwhelming. So I had times when I wrote something completely other, and again, it was not a planned strategy. It was something I just needed to do, and I suppose because Lyonesse being working about different ways of writing about loss, it did send me back to writing more directly. This is me writing about losses. And
mhm,
the new Lamps for Old is a title I've had for a long time. It was a poem published years ago, and it is set in Cornwall because there are cliffs in it. And I knew that I wanted to expand that more, but sometimes it isn't given to you, or you can't take it. You have to wait
mm,
until even a phrase reveals what was packed into it. And perhaps through writing quite a number of the Lyonesse poems and being moved on with the imagination there, that I realised that New Lamps for Old did mean the new life I've had.
sure,
It's bereavement, it's a long passageway out. And all of the illumination you have of a life when you're with a life companion. We're
yeah,
both poets. I mean, you have to be very careful not to look back at the past with rose-colored spectacles.
of
But we,
course,
we did have wonderful times. And so that illumination is the old lamps that life has, with Peter's death and also with aging, that had changed. But the new lamp, I suppose, in a way, was Lyonesse that shone
yeah,
onto the imagination and enabled me. And again, you're talking about sequences in the new lamps for old. I've included a sequence that was written at Swarthmore Hall, the Quaker retreat centre, a very famous house in Quakerism up in Ulverston. And that I wrote a series of poems there that were around an anniversary of Peter's death in
yes,
June. And so that again was finding what illumination is there in my life
hmm,
now. 'Cause I live alone. I mean, I'm very close to my brother and to my daughter, and I have good friends, but I'm on my own a lot of the time. So it's up to me to illuminate that life. And obviously, if you're a poet, that's where you go to for illumination.
sure.
So,
I mean, this is just a bit of serendipity, but there was something. You have a lovely poem in this Kandinsky at the Tate, and
oh,
where you're swimming through Kandinsky, and Tate lifeguards sit on a high black observation stool. But actually, it actually put me in mind of one of my favorite of Peter Redgrove's poems, and it's again it's called "Dipping into the Tate." And it's funny because I had these lines. I had been looking at them as with the bucket, dipping into the Tate, as with the bucket of oneself into a well of colour and odour, to smell the pictures, to sniff up the odours of the colours, which are the fragrance of people excited by the pictures. That was a poem he wrote called "Into the Rothko
Wonderful
Installation."
poem. Yeah,
Yeah, isn't it? And I'm
lovely, lovely
thinking,
poem.
like your poetries are obviously different, but they share, I think,
Yeah,
certain fundamental kind of,
yeah,
I don't know, excitement or a sense of spiritual quest. I think it's
yeah.
com-
We did share that, and also we shared sort of. I can't paint at all, but we're in Cornwall, which is a painter's county, and we've got our own Tate, and so, and years ago we used to go to the Tate a lot. So kind of that is was part of our life as two people together,
yes.
and I'm sure that those lines were playing away in the background when I wrote that poem. Ah, yeah.
We might ask you to read because I know you have the final poem that you're going to read for us.
Yeah.
Is from that section New Lands for Old, and it's called "Other Elements."
Other elements. I can't say my life anymore. Instead, I say the sun took me along the way in an air orient. I was taken. I won't say my life is like this or like that. I leave it to its fate, the sprite of the moment, putting its mark on me, never to be shifted. Our days of life were days I remember and forget 100 times a day, sweet as old radio tunes heard in the foreign street. Those days came and went. I loved them so. If you think you're forgotten, days, think again. That day has yet to dawn.
That's great. I love those last lines. If you think you've forgotten days, think again. That day has yet to dawn. I love that notion of the persistence of the days of our lives and how they run like a kind of constant stream under our
Yes,
daily life. So that, I mean, that's a good place to end our talk, maybe, and to move you on to
sure.
the toaster challenge. This is where we give you the length of
Ah,
time that it takes to make a slice of toast, to talk about a book that has meant something to you.
indeed.
So, and then I'll count you in, and we'll add in the very expensive toaster effect
Oh, yeah.
later, and then I'll say one,
Well,
2, 3, and off you go. So, in your own time, then. I mean, and
collected early poems, 1940 to 1960, by Denise Levertov. I've been thinking a lot about rereading of late because I am lax about the discipline of rereading. At present, I'm rereading the novels of Muriel Spark, but that's another story. I'm also systematically and chronologically rereading Denise Levertov, whose work I discovered back in 1967 when I was 20, when few role models were available to me as a woman poet. Finding Levertov's poems gave me affirmation, purpose, permission. If our first readings of a key poet are passionate, of falling in love, then rereading is dispassionate, unties knots in the relationship between poet and reader, revitalizes the reading experience. Levertov's early poems reveal a survivor, adaptive to life's challenges. A poet must not break, says Pound. She did not break. As a reader, I am a goldfish swimming round the bowl of literature. I forget lines, bits of poems, and then the impact of them comes to me brand new as I swim towards them for perhaps the umpteenth time. I'm thrilled to rediscover here very early poems Levertov set in Cornwall, where I've lived since 1970. Here's the beginning of Durgan, which is a creek upriver from my home in Falmouth. At Durgan, waves are black as cypresses, clear as the water of a wishing well, caressing the stones with smooth palms, looking into the pools as enigmatic eyes peer into mirrors. Here's a first sighting of the well, set to reappear in her great 1961 Muse poem of that name, still ahead of me in my rereading pilgrimage. Levertov was born in Ilford in 1923. Of her father, she says, his Hasidic ancestry, his being steeped in Jewish and Christian scholarship and mysticism were factors built into my cells. Being part Jewish, part German, Welsh and English, notes Levertov, lent her a sense of being special rather than being excluded. In 1947, she married the American writer Mitchell Goodman and moved to the States. The American vernacular gave her a conduit for new, revelatory impulses. All at once there's immediacy, vivacity, colloquial openness, and tactile daring. To the Snake closes the volume, combining myth and reality, sexuality and the spirit, in an intense summoning and relinquishing of a totem creature. Levertov's fidelity to the imagination has been and remains priceless treasure to me. Green snake, when I hung you round my neck and stroked your cold, pulsing throat as you hissed to me, glinting arrowy scales, and I felt the weight of you on my shoulders, and the whispering silver of your dryness sounded close at my ears. Green snake, I swore to my companions that certainly you were harmless, but truly I had no certainty and no hope, only desiring to hold you for that joy which left a long wake of pleasure as the leaves moved and you faded into the pattern of grass and shadows, and I returned, smiling and haunted, to a dark morning.
That's great. That was Penelope Shuttle talking about collected earlier poems, 1940 to 1960, by Denise Levertov. And she was also talking about her own book, Lyonesse, which is published by Bloodaxe Books and is available now. Okay. That's great, Penelope. It's lovely to hear that because again, I'm very fond of Denise Levertov, and but I think that I must get hold of that. I don't know if I have various collections. I don't know if I have that particular particular, but it's. I was reading a poem.
Can you
Yeah.
see it?
Yeah, it was beautiful to hear that.
Wasn't it?
Oh,
I love her.
yes, it's wonderful.
Does that have a poem? There's a poem I was reading of hers last night called "The Rain Walkers," where it's one of her New York poems where she's just crossing a street in New York.
I love that poem.
And there's a man with his two dogs. And
oh yeah.
Do you know that? And I don't know if that's slightly later or if it's in that era, but
No,
I look because I love her New York poems as well. You know, just that kind of the observation and she's a very interesting figure. I think.
I loved when you said that. It was lovely when you said you start with passion when you're passionate about a poet, but then you come back with dispassion. It was very interesting you said that.
Yes, because I can't follow. I respect it, but I can't follow Levertov into her more religious phase. Later on, I mean, the poems are wonderful, but I don't share the faith that she finally chose. So you kind of think, oh well, I wouldn't have done that if I were you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was beautiful to hear. The poems are beautiful, Penelope. It's going to make a really good slot, isn't it, Peter?
It's going to be great, yeah.
I really enjoyed it. It's a lovely thing to do. Thank you so much. It's just lovely to be able to talk about the book. Your questions were lovely.